Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Ted Ruger, the Dean of Penn Law. We have a special episode for you today, done in connection with Bloomberg Law. We'll focus on the privacy, security, and safety of driverless cars. We're pleased to have join us today two experts who can explain what some of the key issues and concerns are for industry, for regulators, and for consumers. First, we have Christopher Yu, a professor of law, communication, and computer and information science here at Penn. He's also director of Penn Law's Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition. And joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Stephanie Beasley. She's the federal transportation reporter for Bloomberg BNA, where she covers a range of transportation issues, including the advent of new transportation technologies like vehicle-to-vehicle communications and autonomous vehicles. So let's get started. Christopher, let's establish some context first. So if I say I'm driving a self-driving car or an autonomous vehicle, what does that mean? Is it my ordinary car that I just take my hands off the wheel, or is it a different vehicle altogether?
It depends on the car we're talking about. So many features of cars are automated now. My new car locks the doors automatically once I hit 10 miles an hour. We used to do intermittent windshield wipers by turning them on and off. All that's handled by the car. We're starting to see functions like the parallel parking function, where you press a button and it solves the problem that stymied teenage drivers in their driving tests for years. There you do, for a very short time, surrender control to the car. There's lane keep assist technologies that help you from drifting. Some just give you a warning and leave it up to you. Some will actually take over and keep you in lane. Some will brake for you. But the most extreme version are the cars that completely take over for you from point to point. You lease all control. Some of them require you to sit behind the wheel and be ready to take over at a moment's notice. The Google car has no steering wheel, and it's completely up to the computer. And in fact, the chairs face inward, so you're looking at each other. Has no steering wheel. Interestingly, it does have a rear view mirror because the law requires it, but aside from that, it's never going to get used.
Mm-hmm. So Stephanie, Christopher mentioned the Google car. Talk a bit about the private sector development here. Is this being driven by technology companies like Google? Is it being driven by the auto manufacturers? Is there competition between those two sectors?
Well, definitely, I would say there's competition. And as was mentioned, Google has taken sort of a pioneering role in this space. Back in 2009, it launched its self-driving car project, and it's been moving forward pretty quickly, logging in lots of testing hours for its automated vehicle technology. And of course, it has the prototype without the steering wheel and the pedals. But now we're starting to see some of the traditional car makers, automakers catch up. Ford has announced plans to have a fleet of autonomous vehicles for a ride-sharing service available by 2021. You have GM has partnered with Lyft to do a very similar thing with ride-sharing. And of course, Uber introduced its first fleet of self-driving cars in Pittsburgh in September. So you're seeing definitely lots of companies in the space competing, and Google, of course, was one of the leaders, but it could be surpassed maybe in the future. We'll have to see.
So Stephanie, what are we seeing in terms of government regulation in this area? Is the government facilitating these developments? Is it hindering them? What's the government posture among the states and federal government?
Well, this is an area where the government actually seems to be catching up a bit. As Christopher mentioned, there are, semi-autonomous vehicles on the market. We're getting to a place where we're, anticipating fully autonomous vehicles. But up until very recently, we hadn't heard from federal regulators about how they were planning to approach regulating this technology. And then in September, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration put out a guidance document, sort of laying out its plans for regulation in this area. And that guidance included a 15-point safety assessment. And basically, the agency is saying it would like to see the auto industry voluntarily comply with the safety assessment, which includes building in privacy and cybersecurity protections, making sure that there are testing and validation methods for the design of the car, also coming up with plans for sharing information, because what NHTSA has said is they want to be careful that automakers in this space aren't repeating the same mistakes. If there is a problem identified with a fully autonomous vehicle, for example, that maybe Chrysler has, we don't want Toyota coming into the space and making the same mistake. So it includes this, NHTSA includes the safety plan and talks about where they see the car is going, and they're anticipating, of course, we'll eventually have fully autonomous vehicles. The guidance also included state policy, a model state policy, because states are also moving forward in this area. California, for example, has draft regulations, some of which are very concerning to the auto industry. One in particular, regulation will require a licensed driver in all vehicles, whether it's fully autonomous or not. And of course, that is worrying to some members of the industry who are envisioning a future where you don't necessarily have to have a licensed driver. You know, if you talk about a fully autonomous vehicle, it's possible that you could have, like, you know, a blind person in the car that would be able to operate it. Or maybe there's a future where you just have a child in the car. But if we have regulations like what California is proposing, that would not be possible. So you have NHTSA moving forward with that. It also just released some best practices for cybersecurity, putting out a risk-based approach saying that auto manufacturers should have a way to identify and mitigate potential cybersecurity risk. Also, again, with the information sharing, they want to make sure that auto manufacturers can share information with each other, but also with outside cybersecurity researchers, so people who aren't affiliated with the company. And they also have some consideration in these best practices for, people plugging in cell phones or laptops or tablets into these self-driving cars, and saying that auto manufacturers should be thinking about how to still have these cybersecurity and privacy protections in place, even if that's happening. What's interesting about that is NHTSA also says that the device producers themselves should be thinking about that, how, your Samsung or your iPhone might interact with your fully autonomous vehicle in the future. So NHTSA is definitely moving forward in this space, but I do want to say that all of these are voluntary sort of guidelines, recommendations. They aren't regulations yet.
Christopher, let's discuss some of the research you're working on with your center. One of your new projects in this area focuses on these cybersecurity issues, the connection between privacy and security, and all of the technology that we're going to see in our cars, or maybe already see in our automobiles. What are some things that we ought to be concerned about as we move to these smarter cars, so to speak?
So it's interesting. One of the big problems we have with the vehicles, and it's not just the autonomous vehicles, the NHTSA proposal that Stephanie mentioned is about all cars. And you may have seen on YouTube, there's videos of someone sitting in the passenger seat of a Jeep, with a laptop, turning on the brakes, the steering, and all of these different features of the car, which are all connected to radios now and all electronically switched. And so, unfortunately, the engineers, to their credit, really were trying to design the best possible product. They weren't necessarily thinking about how would this technology deal with a hostile environment with people trying to attack it. So one of the projects that we're working on here at Penn, in conjunction with Michigan and Duke, research at each of those places, is designing privacy and security for autonomous vehicles and other systems, medical devices, and other things that are really at the cutting edge of what we're doing. And there's a bunch of problems. What do you do with what we call zero-day attacks? If there's a known security problem, an attack, we can try to remediate it. What do we do the first time you see something? How do you design a system to anticipate that? Very hard to do, but there is a technical solution we're working towards. Another question is, to make that system work, we actually have to have the cars share information. And in addition to autonomous cars, we also talk about connected cars, where they are actually beaming to each other information about what they're doing to increase their safety, to mitigate traffic congestion, any one of a number of different things. All of a sudden we have, in addition to a security problem, we have a privacy problem. If your car is telling everyone where you are and where you're going and where you've been, all of a sudden that's information that can be quite sensitive to some people. We're actually designing systems to find ways so that information can be shared in a way that allows the technology to do what it needs to do, but without compromising the personal information of people by masking it or by using a technique we call differential privacy to make it harder to identify exactly who it is.
Is that similar to what we do with health data?
Absolutely. And there's some new techniques. It's actually, they're old techniques, but we're trying to take them to another level. You hear some skeptics say differential privacy has been around for 30 years, we've never made it work. Well, we're trying new things right now. And in fact, it's a new application. But the interesting thing is, the old world used to have big data centers with lots of information, which made it easier to secure them, but it was a huge target for a bad guy. The structure of autonomous vehicles is to have little bits of information distributed in lots of different places, which is some ways tougher to secure, but there's no big target for information anymore. But then the question is, how do you, on a temporary basis, allow them to feed the information into a central location where they can use it the way they need to without compromising their privacy? And that's essentially the design of the research we're doing.
Stephanie, you've written about these cars that talk to each other, this so-called vehicle-to-vehicle information technology. From a business perspective, is this something that will be embedded in the car from the manufacturer, or will we buy this from a communications company? And say a bit about the competition between these two sectors in this area.
Right. So the Department of Transportation actually submitted a proposed rule for vehicle-to-vehicle communication to the Office of Management and Budget earlier this year. So the rule would require that manufacturers actually have that technology in the design of the car once it's on the market. So that's what they're moving toward. But what has happened is that more than a decade ago, the FCC set aside a band of what's called wireless spectrum for the auto industry for this purpose, for vehicle-to-vehicle communication. But of course, many things have changed in the last decade. You have lots of new devices that use wireless spectrum, again, talking about cell phones, laptops, etc. And the Wi-Fi industry has requested to be able to share this spectrum with the auto industry, and has gone to the FCC and gotten the Department of Transportation involved with this. Of course, the auto industry is concerned about that. The spectrum, of course, was set aside for them many, many years ago, and they want to make sure that they have it protected for the use of vehicle-to-vehicle communication. But one thing that's interesting about this is some of the Wi-Fi industry members have talked about the fact that they don't know if the auto industry is actually able to secure or to protect against some of these cybersecurity or privacy threats. So what you're seeing is a little bit of infighting between the two industries over this wireless spectrum. At this point, it still is designated for the auto industry, and Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx has said it should remain so until it's proven that the two industries could share this without that sharing interfering with what's going on with the automobiles. Of course, the Department of Transportation doesn't want to have any instances where maybe your car malfunctions while you're driving in it because there's someone else using that spectrum. So at this point, it sounds like Secretary Foxx has said that he expects that vehicle-to-vehicle communication rule, the draft rule, to be released before President Obama leaves office in January. So it looks as though DOT is definitely planning to move forward with that, despite some of the protests from the Wi-Fi industry. But maybe, DOT and FCC are testing some tools that would allow for the two industries to share. So it could be that in the future they actually are able to do that. But at this point, it doesn't look like that's happening. At least the DOT is planning to hold on to the spectrum.
Christopher, do you want to add to that in your own research about the FCC spectrum and the competition?
It's really unleashed a different political dynamic. Traditionally, communications law has been about people in the communications sector, and there's a certain politics that go with that. Bringing in the auto industry is a very different set of dynamics, and it's unsurprising to me that the Secretary of Transportation thinks the most important possible use for this would be transportation. And actually, I'm quite sympathetic, don't get me wrong. I think autonomous vehicles have a tremendous future, and connected vehicles generally. On the other hand, Wi-Fi has been an incredible benefit to all of us. I mean, I don't know any of us who don't use it. And in a way, the Federal Communications Commission, who owns that part of it, is really programmed to put those uses above everybody else. And so one of the problems we have here is a huge increase in the demand for wireless devices generally of all kinds, and a very limited amount of spectrum and people who have to referee how that's going to happen. Beyond the actual use of the spectrum, there's the question of, okay, if you connect these cars and they're sending data to some other third party, what limitations can we put on the use of that data? How long can they retain it? Could they correlate it with other pieces of information to serve other purposes? I say that because the answer shouldn't automatically be no. A lot of the great innovations we have now today have come from innovative uses of data to actually create new functionality. Not exactly appropriate for cars, but one that everyone knows about. Google Translator was done by taking two pieces of data that were collected for other reasons and correlating them together to actually increase the functionality. No one expected that at the time, and there may be uses like that in the future here. The big question is, how do we create an environment that is that provides adequate protection to consumers, but maintains the kind of flexibility and innovative environment that we have today? Those rules, that aspect of the rules are very much in flux and aren't really going to be resolved by the Department of Transportation either way.
Christopher, in terms of the forecast for self-driving cars, how close is this to being something, a reality for all of us on the road? So if you're driving home from Penn Law to your home 5 years from now, 10 years from now, are you going to be holding onto the steering wheel in those time periods? When will this really be a difference in each of our lives?
I think that difference is starting to happen now, and in the 5 to 10 year horizon, it's only going to grow. The question is really how fast. As most people have probably heard, Uber is testing self-driving cars in Pittsburgh, so in Pennsylvania, it's already a reality, certainly in the trial case. And one of the interesting problems we have is every time you hear about, say, for example, the fatal crash in Florida with the Tesla car, we have a tendency to say, well, that one person was injured, we have to stop this. And this is a classic example of not letting the perfect being the enemy of the good, which is there's huge problems. The biggest cause of problems in the country right now is, in terms of cars, is drunk driving, often fatalities through driver error. Another is congestion, which we lose an enormous amount of time. And so when you think about the safety issues surrounding the self-driving cars, as opposed to what? Really, if you don't have self-driving cars, it's not as if we're going to have perfect safety. And so what we really have to consider is the balance across 5 to 10 years about how to create the benefits of this technology that will let people drive safely and, in fact, increase people's productivity, because what we're going to have is people have less commitment of time sitting in traffic waiting for the jams to clear. The real question is, how fast are we going to get there? And in fact, we can create environments which, if, one of my favorite stories is when I was in Europe, they said with great pride, we have a self-driving car too, we are pushing it into tests. I said, that's great, where have you tested it? They said, we tested it in California because the laws are too restrictive in Europe, we can't do it here. And that to me is probably a bridge too far, where we have these very interesting technologies. I think they're coming. The big question is, what is their role going to be? You could see some of them for deliveries on the low level. They talk about in some remote areas of the country whether trucks could be self-driving in ways that are quite safe. And it's not clear to me there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this. And it's very clear, since all the different states have taken slightly different approaches, there probably won't be a single answer to this. But what I do see, this is a technology that's coming and that we've just barely scratched the surface.
Stephanie, as a journalist who's an expert in this area, what's one or two of the big takeaways that you'd like our audience to have about this emerging technology?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that we talked about what's going on at the federal level, and I think it's important for people to note that, again, what the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has put out are recommendations. They're not binding, and so we don't really have federal regulations in this area. And I think a big part of that is because the technology continues to evolve. And what you're seeing is the Department of Transportation trying to come up with an approach that is flexible, which is what, the auto industry and others in this space are pushing for, and not too prescriptive, but also going into some of these areas that the Department of Transportation hasn't dealt with traditionally before, like cybersecurity, privacy. That's not something that has typically fallen under the purview of the Department of Transportation. So I think what you're seeing in this space is the federal government trying to catch up, trying to keep up with this. But at the same time, you see states moving forward. As I mentioned, California, Pennsylvania is another state. So what I'm seeing is maybe over the next couple of years, there probably are going to be more discussions, particularly here in Washington, D.C., amongst Congress members about what to do. I think there's a lot of concern about states coming up with different regulations that aren't uniform and what that means if you're talking about taking an autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicle across state lines and the two laws don't match, that might cause some issues. So I think this is going to be a big discussion moving forward, but I think there is a lot of caution at the federal level amongst the agencies and amongst lawmakers about how to come up with regulations without hindering the development of new technology. So yeah, I think that's very important, and it's similar to what's happening in the space of drones, where you're seeing that happening almost simultaneously, this new technology developing, and the agencies really trying to figure out the best way to regulate without sort of stopping innovation from happening.
Christopher, as a researcher who studies these areas, what do you hope that policymakers will take from the research that you and your center are doing?
I think the policy communities have to understand that there's always a trade-off. Companies could spend 100% of their R&D budgets on security. One, they would have no product because they wouldn't develop that. And second, the car would not be 100% secure, because the nature of security is that it's always a balance. And so what we need is to calibrate the metrics to understand when is enough is enough. You know, what is the optimal amount of protection, because otherwise you really defeat the whole purpose. So our hope is to at least pioneer a technology that has the capability of providing greater security and some ability to determine how to strike that balance. But even more so, if we can start to get a conversation at the industry level about what the standards are, it will help economically the industry organize around certain approaches. But the way it works in terms of legal terms, it also, if there is an industry standard, it feeds into what the reasonable expectations of the consuming public are, and draws the lines about who's responsible for what in a way that the industry needs to deploy what should be a tremendously innovative technology that should benefit a lot of people.
Stephanie and Christopher, thank you for your insights. We've learned a lot, and we can look forward to a day when we don't have to teach our teenagers to parallel park.